I'm very excited to bring on Fraser Waldron, who is one of the most exciting individuals I've met. And he has a wealth of experience in his life and also career. But I think what really distinguishes him is are the frameworks and the principles he distilled from these the journeys he's traversed through life. And I'm sure we'll hear about that today. And particularly, I'm interested in how you manage different emotions and adversities, just to have a peek into the conversation. But lead us away by giving us a quick intro to yourself and maybe your life story. Who are you, Fraser?
Who am I? I don't even know who I am. You know, where am I? Who am I? But no. First off, thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it. You said I was exciting, but that's debatable. Ask my friends, and they might say I'm boring. But so first off, just thank you for having me here in the first place. It's a fantastic opportunity. I'm definitely excited to talk about anything today, but specifically on how to get through adversity, things of that nature. It's something that I like to focus on. But I'll give you kind of my background, and then we can take it away from there. So thank you again for the conversation. So my name is Fraser, last name Waldron. I'm from Canada originally, so I'm an expat in Singapore. Born in Vancouver at the beginning, moved to a small town, which kind of colored my my perception of reality. So I'm from a small town in Canada, mostly. Once I was done high school, I went back to Vancouver, did my university there, played some sports as well. I played Canadian football at university, which is a whole other tangent in my life. And then from there, initially went into finance, doing trading, things of that nature in equities. So that's my one love right there, is in the sort of financial sphere. I'm still in that game to an extent. And then after a few years, I realized I needed to pivot to something from making money to doing something, at least to me, that was more meaningful. And so I went into the law enforcement path. That was always something I was interested in. I had a neighbor when I was growing up who lived in our sort of cul-de-sac, and she was a Royal Canadian Mounted Police Officer, which is the Canadian Federal Police. And she had done lots of really interesting things, and she'd tell me these crazy stories. And so that kind of inspired me, let's say. So I joined the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, worked in northern Canada, sort of up near the top of the province of Saskatchewan, right on the border of the Northwest Territories. So you can Google that. It's really, really remote locations. Did that for a few years in sort of a frontline policing context. And then also went to the city of Calgary. So I worked for the Calgary Police service there, mostly as an intelligence officer working in counterterrorism, national security, things of that nature. And then after a few years of that, pivoted to something called our Ministry of Public Safety and Solicitor General, which is in British Columbia, the province, west coast of Canada, where I worked in crime reduction initiatives, things like that. And then from there, I pivoted to my current role, which is in Singapore, working with Interpol, so the International Policing Organization, where I am in the Organized and Emerging Crime Directorate, where I focus mostly on detecting and observing people who are doing crimes transnationally on the topic of sexual crimes. So finding transnational sexual offenders and preventing and detecting them from gaining access to vulnerable populations. So that's kind of me in a nutshell. Yeah, that's kind of my professional career.
So you've seen a lot of bad things over your life.
Yeah, well, that's something we can talk about, because you're right. From one perspective, things can be bad, but from another perspective, things can be an opportunity as well.
Yes.
But definitely, I would say, in my life, growing up, my scenario was very ideal. I came from a very nice background. Everything was, small, idealistic, Canadian town. And then I've pursued some paths, definitely professionally, that have put me into situations of adversity, in some ways on purpose. And that's sort of shaped who I am today, for good or for bad. I'll let you decide.
So I think, to start, I'm very curious about what were you like when you were a child or when you were a teenager? Because for me, these were the most pivotal years of my life that kind of shaped who I am today. But did some of your interests start there, or does the Fraser story start at high school, for example? Where does it begin?
Yeah. I think in regards to a career path, at a very early age, I knew I wanted to do something on the sort of operational, sort of police or military side. I was always running through my neighborhood wearing camouflage like a goof, like climbing in trees. I lived in kind of a rural area, right? So I was that kid for sure. So I always had an interest in sort of that career path. But like I mentioned, my childhood was extremely ideal. I had great family situation. All my family was in the area. Everything was looked forward to. Anything I wanted to pursue, I had lots of enthusiasm for that. So whether it was sports or any of my interests, my parents were very supportive. So I had this very idealistic kind of context. And then when I went to university, it was kind of more of the same. I was playing football in university, which was a privilege, and I think I was modest enough to appreciate that. That I wasn't the best player, but I was there trying my best, and it was a good experience. But no problems in my life really at all, and that was interesting because it kind of gave me like almost no framework to handle things that were difficult, which we can talk about later on, because I was just kind of hopelessly, nicely naive. So I think the story of Fraser before I went into the policing realm was mostly just one thing after another working out really well, which is very lucky. That no complaints there. And then sort of once I went into the policing path, then my life started to change in different ways based on sort of things that would pop up in my way or bad life circumstances, things like that, which is the story of, I think, a lot of people. That's common fare. And I think so there's kind of two epochs with me. There's a period of time where I was kind of hopelessly naive and just having a great time, and goofy Fraser, which still exists, as you can probably tell, if you know me well enough. But then the other side, which is sort of more serious Fraser, really goal oriented, task oriented. I'm just trying to climb the ladder professionally, but then also live my best life, and that's a lot of introspection, but then a lot of going out and doing as well. So there's those are the kind of the two breaks, and I think that started when I joined policing, which is by definition kind of like a very serious kind of pathway and puts you in scenarios that I hadn't observed before, which was good.
Yeah, that's definitely very interesting, because I was just reflecting on it these days how most kids growing up, their experience has been really smooth, especially the ones came from fortunate, privileged backgrounds. They were not put into situations of failure to learn how to cope with them early on. So later on, when things smash them in the head, they don't know how to get up. And resilience is a trait that I think you would talk a lot about. So how did the transition happen from your two different periods of your life? What were the pivotal moments, or the moments that really that you remember now that you say were the critical points, turning points?
Yeah, good question. It's kind of like it's kind of like when you're growing up and you have an ambition to, let's say, I don't know, something random, like be a plumber, let's say, right? And you always wanted to be a plumber because you've seen it on TV or you've read about it, but you've never actually seen it from the other side. There's kind of like there's reality as you perceive it, but then there's reality as it is. So I think when I went into policing, I knew what I was going to get into. I had sort of an idea of what to expect. I was deep into the weeds of like reading about that topic or sort of the things I would see or the things I would do. But it's much different when you're actually operational, doing work and actually seeing things that are, let's say, traumatic to anyone, but on a regular basis. So I had anticipation of that, but I think even like the first kind of week working in the first kind of policing post, I definitely realized that I was not well armed to deal with really traumatic events. Not from a professional point of view, not like from the job perspective. Like I knew what to do. The handcuffs went on, people go to jail, like that was easy. But how to deal with that psychologically, I realized very quickly that I came from this very like pristine bubble of loveliness, and I do find. If anyone's listening to this, half the people will know what I'm talking about. But you are correct. Like there is a certain cohort of people, and this is not a bad thing, but you can actually maneuver through life in this very nice way and really have nothing traumatic happen to you for a long period of time. Maybe people pass away, but there's runway on that, things like that. But there are a certain cohort of people who have those kind of experiences on a regular basis, and so it was my transition from one cohort being in this kind of bubble of naivety, let's say, to this other kind of cohort where now I'm where the rubber meets the road, where there's kind of a sense of reality. And very quickly I realized that I needed to inoculate myself with some strategies or bring some strategies to the table to better process and be more effective and be a better person in general to work through those things. So that was kind of like the moment. So probably even my first week of policing in this very northern community, that would have been my first moment for sure.
So it was first through your own eyes of seeing the traumatic experiences happen to other people, but then I think later on, it did come to you as well through different.
For sure,
struggles you had.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. So I'll give you an example. So for example, I worked in a place initially called La Ronge, which is in Saskatchewan, so northern Saskatchewan. It's 4.5 hours north of Saskatoon, which is like the one big city in that province, or the most northerly city. And this was a very remote location, and it just happened to be at the time one of the top 5 jurisdictions for volume of violent crime in Canada, many dozens of times higher than the average. And so one of the things I observed right away, just anecdotally, was that the officers I worked with were often suffering from sort of not necessarily PTSD per se, but just like from having high exposure to really violent events. So for example, like on a busy night, there might be 6 police officers working, and we might take 50 files, and maybe 10 of those would be really extreme violence. So shootings, stabbings, critical injuries, things of that kind of nature. And everyone has kind of a cup where they can handle certain events, but very quickly that cup can overfill. And so what I started to realize was that I'm looking at the people around me, and I'm seeing that there's my coworkers. There's some coworkers handle bad events very well, and some do not. And then even sort of like on the victim side, if you're a victim of a certain crime, some people were able to handle that extremely well and move on the next day, and other people that was traumatizing for life in some cases. So and neither is wrong or right. It's just sort of something I observed, and I thought, I can feel myself vulnerable to having a long-term negative outcome if I don't create some sort of framework to process information more effectively. And so that kind of got me, and so maybe the topic we were talking about today, kind of going very, very quickly into the sort of philosophical literature, the sort of psychological literature, to try to quickly arm myself with the ability to kind of process things, to make me more effective as a operational police officer at the time, but also just to be able to live my own life on a day-to-day basis. So I got super into the topic of the best way to live, let's say, or the topic of how to live, generally speaking.
Sure, yeah. So before we delve into that, I think you're born very observant, and you did make these observations. So the question I had in mind is, how did your colleagues in the police force, how did those that managed the situation well, how did they differ from the ones that didn't? What was the reason that
totally, yeah.
had this difference in the outcomes?
Yeah,
they have some traits, some qualities.
Yeah. No, it's a good question. I would say that. So, for example, like when I was in La Ronge, my answer is kind of anecdotal because I'm sure there's literature on this that goes well, but there's a really good book by Paul Bloom, and it's Compassion versus Empathy, or Against Empathy is the book, and it essentially, and I think this is an answer at a macro level, but I saw this at the micro clearly, where there's some literature that suggests that people who are overly empathetic versus overly compassionate have different outcomes when doing first responder work, things of that nature. That's not the whole purpose of the book, but that's an element of it. And so he would define that, or at least the book defined that, again paraphrasing, that compassion would have been technically defined as like, I'm doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do. And then empathy is like seeing it from the other person's side and feeling what you're feeling if you're a victim in this case. And so there's one good example where they took survivors of or first responders, police, fire, EMS, those kind of guys and girls from 9/11, like the New York 9/11 attacks, and they kind of rank ordered them by compassion versus empathy as their baseline position dealing with those events. And roughly speaking, the people who were high in empathy would describe those days or those weeks as like the worst time ever. My life was never the same in a negative way. And then, high cases of, PTSD, career destruction, suicide, like the really high bad levels of negative outcomes. And then on the other side, the people who who were high in compassion based on surveys were the opposite. They were like, it's a terrible day, but the most important day in my life. I did my best work then. All the training was for this day. It inspired me to do, like the language was different. And when I read that book in particular, I thought, oh, I can actually view things as an opportunity, even if it's really bad, to do the right thing, to console the victim, to arrest the bad guy. Or I can be highly empathetic, which I am. I think I naturally have empathy for people, but if I let that drag me over, then you can have negative outcomes. And I think, again, anecdotally, when I would look at certain first responders, police, fire, EMS, not specifically police, but first responders in general, I could intuitively pick out that some people were a bit too high on the empathetic side of the coin, and that would destroy them, which makes sense, because if you're going from one life, like no one calls the police just because you're arguing over should it be eggs or bacon, it's like worst case scenario, someone's died, someone's stabbed, the worst context of your life, everyone, just even the emotional context is draining. So when you show up, it's chaos, and you're trying to bring some order to a scenario, and often it's really traumatic. Like one time, for example, we had a child under one pass away in a very open context that got hit by a vehicle, and the deceased was actually visible upon arrival, and there was a bunch of people watching that. It's a very traumatic scenario. Just really bad luck. And some of the officers that attended that, I could see were really traumatized, because that's a traumatizing scenario. And I remember I wasn't the first on scene for that, but when I showed up, I thought, this is bad. I can feel it. And I flipped to compassion. I said, I'm gonna be like the good guy here, and I'm gonna do like the best job I can. And so that turns that terrible situation into an opportunity to do the right thing. So even just like little mental flips like that got me out of a potential hole for sure. And I think some people do that. They wouldn't be able to articulate that, what I've just kind of mentioned, but they would just naturally do that on their own, just because that's their personality. And other people have a tough time doing what I just described the other way around, because they wouldn't be able to articulate that that's the path maybe to a better outcome. I don't know if that's my answer.
It makes sense. It's very interesting how I think making people aware of that switch would make them use it more often a lot of times in psychology. And just based on what you said, I think a lot of times when we're forced to confront with our own fragility, with the fragility of our peers, you can on one hand just be totally torn by it and have a deep moment with reality and rethink your whole assumption about life and death. Or on the other hand, you can really shine through with a torch and see the light in the darkness, and push through with the strength that has been carrying you for all this time. Sometimes people say the ignorance is a bliss, but I think it's the with the knowledge as a weapon to overcome whatever is the reality that is out there. So but I went on a tangent.
No, it's good. Well, and I'll add one other thing here. This is just not, let's say, because first responder is very, very specific. Like, you've picked a career path that's like going to be that, right? But just on a sort of like everyday basis, like entropy exists, right? Like, bad things are going to happen. The world doesn't fit your narrative necessarily, right? Like, and I'll give you a perfect example from a policing point of view, but you can see how this would be articulated. Often, crimes like a theft, like in Canada, there's laws of car theft, right? So people steal cars, and then they drive them and they crash them or whatever. But that's a relatively Canada's a safe place, but that's a relatively high crime that happens often in certain jurisdictions. And so when people have their cars stolen, I've never seen anyone super distraught about that, because it's baked into the narrative of your life. Like, you hear about it enough on the news, or you kind of have an awareness of it. So you're upset, but you're not like losing your mind upset, right? Because in your mind, you're like, well, if that was going to happen, whatever. not downplaying it, but people usually go, okay, that's not the end of the world. There's insurance. Like they can see, but if you have a home break-in, a lot of people in Canada perceive and I say everywhere, perceive their house as like, and I've made this mistake too, as like an unpenetrable fortress that there's just no way that would ever happen. So it's not even in the figment of your imagination. And I find that that's where the trauma occurs often more than the actual act itself. So many times you go to a break and enter, nothing's even stolen, but like the dignity of the space is violated because of that. Again, in theory, maybe the guy hasn't even been inside, maybe the door's just broken, but it's deeply traumatizing, and you can see people are like really upset, like to the bone, and you maybe you follow up 2 weeks later, and they're they've like moved to a different city, like you get these really extreme reactions, and then in my mind, because I've seen so many break and enters, if someone broke into my house, I'm like, well, yeah, of course, because like why wouldn't they? Because if you go to a 10, in your mind it's going to happen. So if someone broke into my house, I would be upset like the stolen car because I've baked it in. So I think everyone has narratives in their or perceptions of reality, and when that reality is broken, often that's traumatic. I've seen that quite a bit. And you can, because some people have really tough lives and something tough happens and they don't even blink, and then the next person is just crushed by it. And often I think it's you never perceived that this could happen to you, and it might. And so that's just something to throw in there.
Right, because most of the time we go through our day-to-day on autopilot with our own narrative until an exception to the rule happens that makes us to reconsider everything at once. It's like your whole foundation is shattered, and then you just don't know where to start. So as we're getting philosophical now,
I can go all day. This is my wheelhouse. I'm excited. Yeah.
So at some point in your life, you picked up philosophy as one of the things in your toolkit to help you overcome that. So so how did you get started? Did you study something in the related fields in college, or was it after your policing career?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, so I took one philosophy class in my undergrad. I did political science, which, political philosophy is one of the 5 branches of philosophy, I suppose, but or core columns you can look into. But I took a political philosophy class that was, like Socrates and Plato and stuff, and I actually didn't find it that interesting because I thought, oh, this is like nonsense. I don't need this. Like, I'm Fraser. Like, I'm 20 and I'm tough, or whatever in my mind.
Football player.
Like, yeah. Let's go to the gym. Like, just have another burrito and eat some more protein powder, So I enjoyed the class, but I didn't pursue it past that. In my mind, that was, it has to be tangible. Like if I can't put my hands on it, it's not real. And that was kind of my, let's say, base case process. But then once I went into the policing realm, and I realized that I need to inoculate myself or create a system to better process information, I got super deep into the weeds of it. So now I'd say my core theme of my life is like consistently, like that I'm looking for on a daily basis is like kind of like what is true, or like what is truth, let's say, as just a general theme. Like I like to be analytical and objective as much as possible, as that's epistemologically possible, let's say. But then also it's like how to live. I think that's like my core code is working on that all the time. So even if I'm at work, like it's always kind of in the back of my mind now, and something I'm passionate about. So when I'm reading philosophy, or I'm reading like poetry even, or I'm watching a movie, I find myself, and I realize that not everyone does this. Recently, I thought, oh, doesn't everyone do this? I'm looking at like the story, or like I'm watching like I don't know. Like a movie or something, and I'm like, what can I take from this so I can leverage it in my own life? But like I'm like thinking about it constantly, 24/7. So when I'm reading a book, I'm reading it for enjoyment, but the actual main underlining reason, like if I'm reading Harry Potter, like or whatever, I'm actually trying to extract something on that topic, like what's the best way to live, and then sort of the honesty or the truth element of that is wrapped into it. So that's kind of like my core code now, and that spark initiated when I started to actually have tangible success with applying strategies like that compassion, empathy I was referring to. As soon as I framed things like that, I was like, oh, I'm much more effective and efficient, and that's kind of an element of my personality too. So I thought, oh, well, if I can use this, what else can I use? And then it's just gone on a wild goose chase since then, with tangible results for me personally. And if I can share that, that's cool too.
Yeah, of course. So so the day-to-day philosophy made a lasting impact to you on in your work and your personal journey. Um, what was the biggest benefit you got from that, and how did you apply that? If you had to impart today with just one thing throughout your life from these practical philosophers.
That's a big question. So,
or maybe the most recent one you.
No.
About,
Your question is good, but it's, I'm no fun at dinner parties, because as soon as you bring this stuff up, I'll talk all day, as you can imagine. I think the most impactful thing for me, at a sort of macro level, from my perspective, for my life, is that I think before I got into the weeds of the philosophy, I hadn't considered this topic, and I was just kind of blindly moving through reality in a sort of a haphazard manner. Not just on things that were difficult or traumatic, but just in general. I was just kind of I was floating. So the culture that I was in and the narrative around me just kind of took me along the ride, where now I feel like I have a framework that I've created from all the different kind of religions and theologies and philosophies of life, let's say, and I've created my own structure to move through life in a way that that has meaning to me. So I've created so far, and it's always changing. It's not fixed. It's not like a leap of faith in the religious sense where I've got a fixed dogma and I'm stuck on it. But I have sort of a template on how to live life, and I employ that every day. And then when I put my head on the pillow at night, I feel pretty good because what I'm doing is meaningful to me, and I feel pretty robust. And I've attempted to test that framework, which I've created, which is an amalgamation, and we can talk about it, an amalgamation of a few different thoughts and concepts. And I've tried to go around and find situations and test it against it. And so far it's been pretty good, including some traumatic scenarios as well. So I've kind of created my own, philosophy for one that fits me. It won't fit for everyone. Everyone's got their own kind of element to pursue. But I think I'm deep enough in the weeds now where I feel pretty comfy in my day to day, which wasn't the case before. I was like, what's the point? What am I doing? Like that, those kind of existential questions, where now I actually feel quite sturdy in my structure. I feel like I've created a foundation of a house when it comes to how to move through the world. That's a big, ridiculous answer, but that's kind of,
I think it's only when you go through something with your own eyes, with your own feet in the shoes, that the lessons you extracted are the most durable. Otherwise, you learn it from a leadership class, from an MBA class. It will never be internalized as much as it came from you originally. So that's my experience as well. So for Fraser, what was your first encounter with adversity? What life experiences that got you to start thinking about the topic of adversity and how to overcome it and come up with your own frameworks?
So I think
if you don't mind.
Oh yeah, no, for sure. There's been different moments, definitely. I think that like just growing up, you have adversity. I mean, everyone has adversity. Everyone's life is difficult in their own context, right? Like everyone's journey is difficult. Like suffering to me is like baked into the cake. Like it seems to be like a fact almost. It's like part of the human condition to suffer. But I guess. So like even when I was growing up, if you play sports and you lose a game, that's adversity to an extent, and do you how do you handle that kind of stuff? So I feel like my life course was within the normal range of experience in Canada, which was really good. And then when I went into policing, it created interest in these kind of topics because I wanted to inoculate myself. And then probably my first real test, and this is kind of off. I don't think I've ever told you this story actually, but was actually kind of interesting. I worked in L'Orange, the first place, which was very like the 25 police officers there, and it actually had a community, had a grocery store you could go to, and had like normal functioning sort of societal things that you feel like you're part of a community. But then I went to a place called Stony Rapids / Black Lakes. Stony Rapids is the hamlet or the community, and then Black Lake is the indigenous reserve there. And in that location, It was very isolated because it was a fly-in only. There is a road you can technically drive, but it's not always passable. So that was a fly-in only community, and extremely violent. I think it was 165 times the average on violent crime comparative to the Canadian average, and less police officers, much more of a difficult place to work just because of the isolation. We had food flown into us, so it's different. It's like camping, for a period of time. And in that case, it was extremely lonely, like just like lonely in the sense that you could walk 500 kilometers in any direction and hit no human being. So like just physically isolated, huh? And the environment we were living in was not friendly to police officers, even if off duty. Like you couldn't walk around the community of Black Lake, let's say, without potential issues, things like that. And so that was actually my first real this is a test, like not just, I can call my mom and she'll fix it kind of test, you know what I'm saying? Because, sometimes the phones didn't work. We didn't have cell reception. There's no cell tower at that time. Internet was spotty at best. We were so far north that when you put the TV satellite, it was straight into the it wasn't shooting up into the sky because they kind of shoot towards the equator or whatever. So it was a really remote place, and I remember there being I'm in trouble, and I could see my coworkers. One coworker, for example, wouldn't wear his uniform at work. You know what I mean? So he'd wear jeans and a Under Armour top with his so he was wearing his vest and his gun and stuff, but because he's emotionally having a tough time, right? So it's just so you couldn't even have your friends weren't necessarily useful to you because they were themselves dealing with a lot of stuff. So it was critically emotionally lonely. And in that context, that's when I really dug deep into the literature to find ways to be comfortable in my own shoes in bad situations. That was the real where I ramped that up. And interestingly, actually, if you're really lonely, if you find yourself at home being oh my gosh, I'm super lonely, at least for me, if you just actually accept that loneliness, that feeling, and you don't just go on the phone and text somebody, if you just let that hit you and accept it and kind of surrender to it. I don't mean surrender to in a negative way, but accept it and just kind of let that wash through you. On the other side of that is relief. So when the COVID stuff happened, and in Canada we had lockdowns and stuff, I was totally fine because I had built the skill set to be alone. And I'm hyper extroverted. I want to see people all the time. But that was my first real test. And again, there's kind of a philosophical element to that as well. And that got me even more interested in that topic. And I had lots of time to read because the internet wasn't really working anyway. So, yeah.
Okay, so loneliness was your first true test of adversity.
That was a big one, yeah. And then that's okay, and it's good. Good opportunity. At the time, it wasn't fun, but now in retrospect, rose-colored lenses, of course. Now I'm I'm glad that happened. It's given me sort of a superpower. I can be by myself, and I can sit in a room, and I can be myself for a period of time, and I'm not. I'm totally comfortable with that because I can just replicate that kind of that strategy to get over it, which is again that sort of self-acceptance of that. Yeah.
So if we can stay a little longer on this topic, loneliness, can you walk us through your thought process, unpack a little more on how to let it wash through you and emerge as a renewed self in the sense that you're above it, you're no longer beholden by it anymore.
Right. Yeah. So everything I say, for example, if I say this is something that I've done, it might not work for you. Maybe it just worked for me. So this is not
usual disclaimers.
Yeah, I'm not like a psychologist being this will work. So take my word for it. And my one actually big insight across all these different topics is that the individual is the unit of analysis for what works. So what works for John doesn't work for Sue. So the things that I've done, I've just kind of gone through all 100 different options and I've picked one that works for me. So in regards to loneliness, I think it is actually sort of Roman era Stoicism. Actually, kind of was my topic. So that's specifically Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, that book. And there's three main tenets of that. If you cut out all the metaphysics, so the gods and then this, that, and just cut it down to how to live through the day. Three things were useful in that context. And one was that you don't control the outcome no matter what. So that's the first one. So just, again, in the context of being out in the remote location, but you could apply this to anything. the outcome is completely out of your control. And you can kind of see that by if you just go like, do I control the weather? Do I control physics? Do I control the stars? And it's like, do I control like my neighbors? Do I control my mom? And the answer is no to all of these, of course. And it's like, do I control me? Well, maybe, but do I control like the individual cells in my body? Do I control the thought before I have it? Do I control my hunger? And very quickly, if you bite onto this, you'll see that your outcome is really out of your control in most cases, and that's kind of an element of that surrender. So I have control, let's say, over the input, perhaps, and that's debatable. But the key element is that the outcome is out of my control, and that relieves you because as soon as you go, you know what? As long as I keep putting the right input in, the outcome is out of my control. That reduces anxiety because the outcome is in the future, right? And anxiety is usually future leaning. So that just in the loneliness context, that was something that I would apply right away. And the second one is viewing reality as it is, which is kind of talked about before, another Stoic concept, where if you're in a scenario, is it good or is it bad? Not from like a moral standpoint, but is it good or bad for me? So if your house burns down, you're sad, but maybe I'm your worst enemy, I'm super happy. Both those things are narratives that we've created. Like what's the difference? So I would strongly believe this, in any scenario you're in, you can reshift any scenario to be an opportunity from something bad, or you can reframe it to be something useful. And then the last bit is to be good in nature, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But the two main ones, plus with just accepting where you are in the moment, allowed me to have that. But it was only actually when I had like the break, like it was like multiple months of being extremely lonely, and then just being. I was actually on a walk, and I kind of had the epiphany that, if I just let this feeling hit me, then, which again is a Stoic thing as well. Like if you have a negative emotion, you can leverage that to something good. If you have a positive emotion, you can leverage that as well. It's not a bad thing to have the negative feeling. Yeah. Again, it's how you reframe these things. So in that particular scenario, I had that kind of that gnawing sense of desperation to remove myself from the scenario, and then I just allowed that feeling to wash over me, kind of like a waterfall, and you can kind of, if you just zoom out, kind of meditative practice, if you just kind of zoom out and you go, I'm having this feeling, isn't that interesting? Let's just let nature take its course and let that feeling reduce the barrier, reduce the defenses, and then at the other side of that is relief. So I can do that almost mechanically now, not necessarily easy to do, but something I do on a regular basis if I get that feeling. So if I'm at home just sitting, I'm like, I feel like I need to socialize, or I feel kind of extra, like I'm in a bad position from a loneliness point of view. I'll literally kind of go through that kind of process, and as soon as I kind of intellectualize it like that, allow that feeling to kind of pass through me, I guess is the best way to describe that, then I have immediate relief. Which isn't to say I can say that like that forever, but loneliness, generally speaking, is something I can deal with much more effectively than I was before. Because at the time I was just, spastic. Like I was like, I need to fix this. I need to quit my job. You start to shoot out in weird directions, which is just kind of a naive way to go about it.
Yeah, loneliness is as bad as we interpret it. At the factual level, reality is just you're alone. But loneliness is a choice in that sense, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, there's definitely each person's going to be different, of course. There's definitely like a biological, underpinning. Like you humans are social, and one way to torture someone is to give them solitary confinement, and that. So I'm not saying that you can just override this completely. And this maybe is something else that we can talk about maybe later. But there is an element of having to deal with yourself by yourself. Forces you to is an opportunity, and this is kind of an aside. So. Don't go into the woods like me for 3 years up in the north. But what you can do is, I find that even if I do it now, I'm sitting at home. I know what I need to do, but I just distract myself. And I really know that I need to go do that, that important work, but I'm just going to go watch a movie instead. And I'm avoiding. And maybe at a macro level, maybe I should quit my career and do something else or something more dramatic. But I'm just going to ignore that. So there is an element of being able to be with yourself in some ways can be torturous if you know you have to go do something. And there's a good book by I think it's Solitude, the Gulag Archipelago, where millions of people went through the sort of Soviet Union communist sort of style gulags in Russia, and one of the key insights from that book, because it's just a fantastic read, I recommend it 10 out of 10, is that the people who were in solitary confinement for like years and like decades and decades often viewed that as the most important time of their life in a positive way. And they actually felt bad for the guards who would like abuse them and hit them, because they were able to deal with their shit, right? Because you're forced. Everything's externally removed from you. You're just in a cell. You're being essentially tortured and abused, and people are dying all around you. But the survivors were like, oh, like he, at least based on his recollection and reporting, would often articulate that experience as super good, because they were able to purify their soul in the sense of like being happy in their own shoes, which is a super interesting concept, or keeping their soul intact or their conscience clear. And they actually felt bad, like had empathy for the jailers who were not forced to go through the same process. So if you are in if you're elderly person, you're in a chronically lonely situation, that's tough. But if you do find yourself not able to be with yourself, in some ways you can view it as an opportunity to square up to the things that challenge you. And everyone knows everyone's going to be different, right? Challenge your mom on something, or get a boyfriend or get a girlfriend or whatever. Like, it's going to be different for each person. But most people know like where they're limited, and often it's just your inability to square up to it. And I think being in a lonely position is actually the place to do it.
Right. It's always when you realize you don't have a line to call your mom anymore that make you actually to think, what can you do yourself to manage the situation?
Totally. Well, I mean, I even did it here. Before we started, you went to just leave for a second, and I thought, oh, I'm kind of nervous to do this, and and normally my own advice is to square up and go do it. And I thought, oh, I'll just go on WhatsApp or Facebook or something, and just or like Instagram, and just kind of like scroll just for a second, like to not square up to it. And it's kind of a similar thing. So part of that, like that, there's an opportunity when you have to deal with yourself. So if you do find yourself in a lonely scenario, you can turn that into a win. Again, it's context dependent, but that's something I've gone. All my self growth has been either through experience that's like in the wind, or like in the wild rather, or I'm by myself and like cutting out the distractions and then finally squaring up to what's the issue, whatever that might be.
Right.
Yeah, but that's not easy. I'm not saying that you just go do that, but it's like and you gotta take a millimeter step at that one thing at a time.
Right, and it's a iterative process. It's never just A to B, then you find the answer, you overcome. It's always, there are micro successes, micro failures as well in the step. A related thought I had when you were talking about the prisoners, where I think a lot of times we anchor our meaning on some external subjects, like our family, like God, religion, or the career we have for some workaholics.
Yeah.
But once that thing is taken away from us, then we are left with just nothing, bare bones of ourselves. And how do you find meaning to continue to be the best version of yourselves without living for someone?
Right.
I think that's when people have to really stand up and say, even if there's no one counting on me, I still have to be accountable to myself. Because it's actually easier for me too, is if you're accountable for other people, which like a lot of the self-help books talks about. You need to have accountability partners in the gym, in other workplaces. So, but I think the biggest triumph is when you find that accountability in yourself without relying on other people. So you define your own meaning. I think loneliness is a part of that. I had the similar experience in a winter where I just stayed at my friend's house. He went back home, so I was alone completely in New York City, and also during the holidays in December. So I would force myself to go out at times just to say hi to the security
for sure
at the gym, just to have micro interactions to make my life so much better.
Right.
And I was signed up for these volunteer events to distribute food to the homeless on the Christmas Day Eve. But I was lost on the way there, and I didn't find the gathering point. So for that year's Christmas Eve, I was just wandering around in the snow in New York City by myself, and then came home after that. And these moments can be really crushing, but also it's when you realize I have to decide, even if nobody cares, I need to put some things on my agenda tomorrow. I need to work towards my goals. I need to still eat healthy, still go to the gym, still, complete doing the laundry, the little things in life.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Yeah, like if your situation isn't working out, you can either be like accusatory and be like, the world isn't bending to my will the way I want it to, generally speaking, or something about me isn't producing the outcome the way that I'm looking for, right? So there's an element of like taking again, you don't control those outcomes, but there's an element of taking control of yourself and actioning things. So you're right. Your story is perfect. Like, you got to set the calendar and go out. And loneliness is an epidemic. Like, definitely in like the older scenario, like often sometimes people would call the police just to like say hi. And we come and we sometimes like make food or dinner or something like that. Like Christmas, New Year's time, people call just to say hi. Hey, 911. So and we would we were empathetic of that scenario. So but it's totally up to the individual to kind of make to like you said, like to move and when bad things or to move on that. It's a difficult scenario. Yeah, especially because humans are so naturally like outgoing, and if you find yourself like without any sort of family and friends around, it can be definitely super difficult for sure.
Right. Yeah. Especially it's relative too. You look at other people. Especially nowadays in social media, you see everyone else is having a social gathering. They're happy with their family. It's all relative in that sense too. It's narratives, perception. So I think, loneliness is one of the biggest battles we all fight at some point in our life. But looking back, what were some other battles you've had to come through to overcome later on? I've had a few. So after and this kind of ties into the sort of your kind of story actually a little bit maybe perhaps, but when you're comment to meaning, like finding meaning and stuff, but so after that policing experience, I went to Calgary, Alberta, and worked in the Calgary Police Service there doing intelligence related work and mostly working in the counterterrorism and public safety space. And in that context, I actually had a bad back injury. So I had to get a surgery in my lower spine, and that took me out for a long time. The surgery didn't go as well as anticipated, and for maybe about a year, I couldn't really walk. I mean, the first month it was really bad, but for almost a year, I couldn't walk for more than 30 minutes or sit for 30 minutes. So I'd have to plan my day, and I go, okay, I'm going to go to the grocery store. I've got this kind of 30-minute walking kind of window, because after let's say 30 to 45 minutes of, let's say, even just walking, I would have enough like leg pain or sciatic pain that I would have to lay down. So wherever I was, I would literally lay down. I used to carry like a little blow-up mattress with me. And so I'd lay down in really bizarre places like H&M, like in between, because I'm just like, I gotta like sit, right? But then sitting would cause pain too. So it's a real nightmare. So I went from full function, running around. I'm about 90% golden retriever energy. I'm running around all the time. How old were you back then?
I would have been like 28, I guess, at that point. And so I had this. So I went from full function, running around every weekend, every day, to no function, which was a blow to the identity, actually, more than anything else. The physical stuff was difficult, but because you have an identity and you think it's fixed, but it's not. Like your identity, if you're, let's say, a police officer or a firefighter or whatever, or an astronaut, like you don't own that identity. It's kind of like you inhabit it for a bit, right? And part of that police identity is to be physically fit and active and do stuff. So that was, and my sporty background, I felt like I'm an athlete, I'm tough, more protein shakes. So the physicality is sad for my identity side of the coin. And then, so I burned through that. And then concurrently, about a year after that surgery, which has been, I guess, 2017, I suppose, after that, I actually ended up getting like an autoimmune thing, which almost got me too. I ended up having like a virus, and it kind of lodged in my immune system in a weird way. And so I spent a week or two in the hospital and had a year of trouble, but I actually thought it was going to kill me at one point too. So the combination of both those made it difficult, outside of my control. And that was a good test, because at that point I had just kind of started to create my framework and solidify it. And that was a crucible to kind of, practice my philosophy of life against like the events that were happening to me in the moment. So I've regained my dance moves. I'm relatively full function. I'm reduced. You won't see me at the gym doing squats for a lot of weight, but I can still go out and dance and run around and stuff like that. But and that's one of the reasons I've actually pursued the Interpol route, because it's physically hands-on, so I'm not operational in that sense anymore. But yeah, so that was probably a traumatic year or two. But I feel like coming out of that, I'm like more of a complete person. So at the time, in the moment, it's difficult, but the sort of the strategies I employed, and some worked and some didn't. But what I came out of that with was I'm definitely more resilient, for sure. We can talk about that if you want.
Yeah, of course. Just how it was. You said over a year, multiple surgeries.
Yeah, so I've had 2 back surgeries in the same location, but the key one was that the last one where I had a microdissectomy where they go in and they take a piece of the disc out at L5S1, so it's the lower lumbar spine and the sacrum, I think, but right at the bottom of your spine, lower back, and they trimmed the disc, but unfortunately there was some scar tissue and things like that. So every time I moved, the nerve that would come down from my lower back down to my right leg would get irritated, and it was kind of swollen and just was a real nightmare. So that took me from being operational, running around every day, to being completely essentially disabled. It changed my whole life outcome, or life course, actually, and that was destabilizing from the reasons I mentioned. It was an identity crisis. So that I had to kind of figure out more meaning, let's say, or change. And this is kind of where your comment was before, where you have to figure out a reason to live, because it was definitely I wasn't depressed, but it was a depressive event, especially because I was still going to the office. You're still around all your peers who are able-bodied and doing what you used to do, and now I'm like in a different position. So from a professional point of view, I leveraged it. A friend of mine, a group of us, we created an intelligence collection methodology program that was unique at that point, still exists, did lots of really good work. So from a professional point of view, I said, fuck it, like, I can't do that, I'm gonna do something else, right? And so I took the worst case scenario and turned it into a pearl, let's say, and that's helped me career-wise in a big way. I actually was doing a PhD on this topic of how to collect information in a kind of unique way, and that's because of my back to an extent, right? So there's always an opportunity to pursue something good, but to perceive it like that is actually mechanical. So this goes back to that Stoic kind of thing, right? It's like, do you control the outcomes? No. Is this a good or bad event? And it's bad by no matter how you frame it, but I chose to view that as an opportunity, or something that's to leverage. And then the third element of Stoicism is to be good in nature. And then to be is to be in the moment, as in, like, I'm not in the future with anxiety. I'm not in the past with regret, because, again, I don't control those things. To be good in the Stoic realm would be to be for others. So agapic love, like to do things that are within your capacity for others. And that's debatable, but that's just the way they would frame that. And then nature would be like the logos, nature as in like a sort of like the environment around you, or God, like the all-encompassing. And to be locked in between those so that you're not different than nature itself. That's the element to be as well. So that's a technical sentence. And essentially those 3 things, applied with something I'll call logotherapy in a sec, allowed me to make good decisions moving forward in all of those negative contexts. So essentially, when I was in that, if I was able-bodied, let's say, before that back injury, I had that framework in place already. And to be good in nature, like that sense, that literally drove every decision I made, and still does to this day. It's brilliant. Try it out yourself. And what that means is that if I'm going to decide between going out for a night of drinking or going to the gym and working out, if I need clarity on that, I literally will just go to that sentence and say, what's the activity, the input that will most likely generate a positive outcome for others in the agapic love context? So not romantic love, but like love for the other, doing something for someone else, which is where you can derive a lot of meaning, which I'll get to in a sec. And because that, to me, I'm pursuing my highest value, the highest calling that will serve the most people, and that has the most, let's say, value to me in the hierarchy of values that you can create, that creates a scenario where the decision becomes easy on that axis. It's just, left or right, but everything crosses through that kind of fiery hoop. What's the best for others? So, and it can change. It can be arbitrary. So if I've been really good for the last 6 months, and I've been really working too hard, and my friends are going out, and I really, want to go do that, then I'll go out and do that because I need to relax, and that'll, put me in a better mind space to be good for others in a different way. But then if on the other hand, if I've gone out 4 nights in a row and I ask myself that question, maybe going to the gym and, having a smoothie is better than going out with the boys for drinks. So I apply that literally on a daily basis 100 times a day.
in all things. Like, should I brush my teeth? Yes, because if my teeth fall out, how can I be for you, be for me, or be for, So it's inherently selfish in the Ayn Rand objectivism kind of way. I'm selfishly trying to maximize my potential, but that benefits you and everyone else,
yes.
right? So see how that all fits together. There's a flaw in that, not a flaw, but a danger where you go, what's best for others? If it's not good morals, then if you're trying to do bad things in the world, then it can twist. So you have to have a strong, objective, fundamental like ethics underneath that. But the little framework is beautiful. I've never made a decision that I've regretted with that moniker. So, for example, I'm hurt my back. I'm in a bad position, and I ask myself, should I lay in bed like a bitch, which I did for many days? It's not easy. I'm not saying it's easy. Or should I go out and do something at work and create this new intelligence collection methodology because that was an opportunity? And of course, the answer is do the second one, or the latter, because that's useful. And so I immediately pursued that without any hesitation, right? And then even if I had failed at that, no issue, because it was the right decision in the moment. So I pursue things now all the time, and because I'm multivariant, I do lots of different things. And as long as I've used that prism to make the decision, I almost never regret the decision ever, because it was the right decision in the moment. And I'm painfully aware that the outcome is out of my control. It can totally fail. And then also, but if it fails, at least I made the right decision. So I almost have no regrets now. Like if I walked out, like coming to Interpol was a big life decision, let's say, moving from Canada here. But I thought, this is where I can contribute the most. This is a super good opportunity in my mind for various reasons. I pursued it. But if I'd come here and I got hit by a bus the first day, like walking out of the airport, I wouldn't have regretted that decision at all, because it was the right decision at the time. And if you just keep doing those one stacked after another, in theory, you can live a pretty good life. Yeah.
So the moniker, the framework you have is, what is the best outcome for others?
Yeah, because you have to create a hierarchy of values. So I've just articulated in the Stoic point of view, and you can insert whatever you want there. It can be like what's best for me, like an Ayn Rand kind of version, right? Like you can pursue it like that. That's for you to decide. But just for me, that's what I perceive as the highest value. It's something outside of myself. And that can be anything you want. In the Stoic realm, it would be like a bird is a bird, a dog is a dog, a cat is a cat. So a human should act as a human should. But there's lots of variation in that. So if you're a builder, go build stuff. If you're like a doctor, go doctor. If you're a mechanic, go mechanic. Whatever you want. But it's got to be intuitive to your intuition. Your intuition should guide you. And that's a issue I have a lot with, because I find I'm more conscious mind versus subconscious, my intuition. So often I find myself going, well, I should become a lawyer because the money, but my subconscious is like, I think you should become like a painter, or whatever, like you actually want to do. And if you don't follow those, there's a neurosis there, right? Which is like the Jungian neurosis, which is like you're fighting against yourself. So I often will, when I'm asking myself that question, I try to make sure that my conscious mind and my subconscious are in alignment. Because if they're not, then I'm in distress, let's say. So should I go to Interpol and do this? Yes, because it feels good in my gut, my intuition. I'm following the image, because like that lines up with where I'm at. But then also consciously, I'm like, yeah, this is a good opportunity, and my conscious helps me, maneuver the bus route, to work. So there's that's something to consider as well. That's difficult.
It sounds so simple, elegant, but also, yes, it has been useful over and over again in situations big and small.
Yeah, it's never failed me because I've taken the outcome out of it, like completely. Whether I fail or not, by anyone's definition, is immaterial, because the decision was right at the moment.
Yeah. So it's the one that most likely lead to the outcome.
Yeah. So it's like you can take any scenario. Should I quit my job or should I not? Let's say, like, you just like make up an example. And then you go, okay, well, I want to become a doctor. Right now the perfect example was when I was in finance. I didn't use this, but I would use this there. I was in finance, making money, doing really well, wearing the fancy suit, whatever, which is good. It's not a critique. And I thought, this isn't, let's say, me per se. What can I do in my life that would maximally give me the most meaning, the most value internally, not money value, but just like internal value. And I thought policing, which was something. And in Canada, being a police officer is not glorious. Like no one gives you a high five for coming to a police officer. So it was on a socioeconomic point of view, not the right decision to make. Loss of income, moving up to the middle of nowhere. Like no one said, Fraser, that's a good idea, right? But in my mind, I was like, this is something I got to do, and I pursued it. So if I were in that same scenario today, I would say, to be good in nature, that's the line. And I'll go, I have my little circle that I'm jumping through, and I go, which path should I take? Should I pursue the policing or should I stay in finance? And the decision would be very easy for me. Now, you might have the different answer because you go, you know what? I'm going to stay in finance. I'm going to make $1 million. I'm going to donate it all to charity or whatever, or helping people with their finances is the best thing since sliced bread. You could be a police officer and switch back the other way. It's not a moral judgment for anyone else. It's just internally what feels good with you. And as long as you pursue what you internally are in alignment with, then you're not in neurosis. You're shooting in one direction, but you really want to go the other. And then your life has no regrets, essentially, because you're making the right decision in the moment. Yes. And you can literally do it like one after another. It's like, for example, I don't really drink alcohol, okay? Or I eat relatively healthy. This is a better one. When I go out for food, sometimes if there's a buffet, like I can't help it. I'll eat everything, like just desserts with whatever. But before I start the debauchery, I literally go, like, is this the right decision or not before? Because once I start, I can't stop. And if I've been eating badly for a week or two straight, and I value my fitness because I want to be fit, again, for the wider community, I don't want to be a burden on anyone, even just from that perspective. I'll literally go, no, it's quick. It's just like, it's like, nah, it doesn't make sense. Bam, that's it. And then I won't be ridiculous. But sometimes I'm like, you know what, Fraser, you've been working hard. You deserve this. It's going to put your mind at ease. And I just eat 10,000 calories and, they have to wheel me out in a wheelbarrow, So that, and I'm talking a lot about Stoicism here. That's just one of my things I use. But that is the most practical day-to-day thing. And then you add your values and your ethics to it. It's like a tool. It's like having a hammer and you've got 2 nails to hit, and it just helps you guide you to which nail you want to hit. That's a bad metaphor, but you
got to have a clear value system first. You got to know
who
are you, what's your identity, what are you made of, what are you here for, is the why question.
So that's practical, like day to day, get through the day. And there's lots of other little tips and tricks and whatever, but that's a good one. That's the framework I like to use. You don't have to, though. There's other versions, like Epicureanism or something like that. Pursue pleasure for pleasure's sake, things of that nature. But that's a whole other bag of apples. But on the regards to meaning, this is just my perspective on this. You can split this up into 2 versions. There's essence, and then there's existence. So essence would be like the universe is made for you very specifically. So that would be like if you were a religious, like Abrahamic faiths version. So like, Christian God creates the universe for you to manipulate, Adam and Eve, like the whole thing. And then that's fine. And you can do that. And you'll actually live a very happy life if you just pursue the local religion of your context. It's the leap of faith, the Kierkegaardian leap of faith. Just pursue the local religion or the local customs around you. Don't think about it too much. You'll probably live a good life because there's probably a pathway that leads to generalized human flourishing. That's a whole other conversation, but that's one way to do it. My brain doesn't work that way, so I am more on the existence side, which is existentialism. So the question of what's the point, where's the meaning, and on that framework, the world isn't made specifically for you, where there's rules and morals built into the system, and you just have to follow them. It's now you have to generate the meaning, and that's a much more different. That's a difficult question. So my pathway along the philosophical realm is like I'm deep in the weeds to try to figure out what generates the most meaning, what's the best way to do it, what's the best way to live. It's taken me a long time to run through it. So I don't recommend it even because it takes a huge commitment. And if you don't find a resolution at the end of it, then you're actually in a state of nihilism because it's very easy to critique all the different philosophies. It's very easy to critique all the religions. And my epiphany on this, let's just say, before we get into it, is that what generates meaning for you is going to be, or what philosophy or what framework is going to be the one that works the best, is the one that you feel strongly attached to. So I have elements of my philosophy of life that are irrational to anyone. Like I like the Eastern sort of element that the world is like a big play and consciousness is in everyone and God's everywhere. Like you're totally irrational. But I'm like, sometimes I'm just like, oh, we're all in a big play and this is fun. It's very, Alan Watts, like watching a crazy YouTube video, that kind of stuff. Listen to him for 5 minutes. I like that. It feels good. Would I present that to anyone in a way like to defend it? Undefensible, unfalsifiable. Epistemologically, it's difficult to articulate the value of that. But internally, I get a lot of juice to squeeze out of that. So I like the existentialist side, and I like specifically because it's a tradition of many different authors and philosophers. And I specifically like the version of logotherapy specifically. So Viktor Frankl, World War II Holocaust survivor, psychiatrist, and he in his book Man's Search for Meaning, which is a 10 out of 10 recommend, he roughly states that there's several reasons to live, like the whys, is to your question, and then you can break them down to externally produced or internally derived. And so the first three are externally in the external environment, and that would be like friends and family. They give you a reason to live. You have a kid and you go, oh my gosh, this kid is my reason to live. Great. Or friends and family and people around you. Yeah. The second one would be work or acts of work. I'm a poet and I write poetry, or I build houses with my hands, like things of that nature, and that derives value too. And then the last one would be aesthetics, which is a branch of philosophy, but aesthetics in like nature is beautiful, things are beautiful. I listen to music and I'm happy, the arts, like that kind of stuff, right? And everything in between, anything you can imagine. And when people say, for example, to me, why do you like live? And they say something like, I want to be happy. This is kind of that, right? It's like, I want to do things that give me meaning. For me, I like to coach football, American football. I get a lot of meaning out of that. To someone else, that's a terrible idea. Like, what's the point? But I generate a ton of value and meaning from that. So when people say, I want to be happy, that's cool. I'm into it. But all three of those things can be just immediately ripped away. This is Viktor Frankl's point. So in the camps, he noticed that the Germans would consciously or subconsciously do this, where you'd show up to Auschwitz or whichever camp, and they would say, put all your valuables in the box, and then they'd throw them on the ground, like right in front of you, to kind of be like, everything that had value to you no longer exists. Your family, split them all up. No value there, no friendships, right? And then, you were a doctor. Okay, well, we'll make you lift rocks. Oh, you're the construction guy. We'll make you the doctor. Like, they just total perversion of or the destruction of the values of meaning. And what he observed was that people would quickly expire and pass away if they couldn't have a reason to live. And so all those things are externally derived. And so then what he found, which is the most interesting thing, and this is Solzhenitsyn too, with the camp survivors in the gulags. So you've got two really extreme scenarios. That's why I like my philosophy to be kind of extreme, because I want it to work in the worst case scenario, in case I'm ever in it. Both, but let's look at Viktor Frankl first. Found that the people who survived, again, it's luck. It doesn't matter what your philosophy is. If the German or the Nazi camp guy wants to shoot you, it doesn't matter what your philosophy is at that moment. But interestingly, anecdotally, he found that the people who survived the most, or who thrived in that environment, were people who derived value from the suffering they were in, not the externally derived elements. So it didn't matter what you looked like when you came into the camp. You could be like the buff, burly guy, or the skinny dude who looked like he's about to die, like just from a stiff breeze. It didn't matter about that as much, because all the external things were stripped away. What matters is if you had an internal generative reason to survive, or to do an internal meaning creation. So so that's it. So essentially, you're suffering. You can suffer well, or you can suffer poorly, however you define that. But that's internally derived, and no one can take that away from you. And that's a key life insight. And then the Solzhenitsyn one is essentially, don't do anything. This is his experience at the camps, broken down in like 1 second. Read the book. Don't do anything that makes your soul unpure, or that corrupts your consciousness. Keep your conscience clean. And if you just, which is to be good nature, to make one right decision after another. So the people who survived in the Soviet Union context, again, it's completely random. It's just, who got a bullet and who didn't. It's just it's a good book to read, but it's terrible outcomes for everyone. But some people legitimately thrived in that environment, and it's not because they were the most corrupted. It was because they were the least corruptible, and that's the key element. So they chose to suffer honorably, or they chose to only do things that they internally agreed with, regardless of the outcome. And that's extreme. If you stack those together, because I think they're the same thing, roughly, I think that's the best way to live. And I've got examples where I personally have leveraged that insight in bad scenarios, totally fine.
So I've read the book, the Search for Meaning. I think it did shape the view I have currently on things as well. I think the key question is how do you do that? It's something that's easy to point out, but then hard to execute. How do you find meaning in suffering? Because it's not intuitive. It's not the default response.
Yeah.
And for me, I think a lot of times when you see hope and despair, it's always for the what comes after. It's always for I'm failing now because I can come back stronger, because I can build up the skill sets when the same situation arises again, then I know how to respond. It's always for the next time that I can emerge stronger. But how do you find meaning in suffering itself, regardless of whether you will face it again or not? So I think, ties back to the two books you mentioned, great examples of that. And we initially put these hopes and our anchor our meaning on other people, but then later on, then we find ourselves in these difficult situations. We accept the suffering first. We're not working against it, and also, as you said, we keep our conscience clear and pure. So it's only know that we're suffering for the purity of our conscience. If just to tie these two together, would you agree with that? So you're suffering even though you can't see a point of this immediately, but is the alternative is worse.
Oh yeah.
So
yeah. I've got good. This is like Eckhart Tolle, right? Like the he's German, I think, but he lives in Vancouver. So he wrote that book. Oh my God, what's the book called? Oh my gosh, I'm losing my mind now.
Something Enlightenment Now.
Yeah, that's it. I think. Now. Yeah, he's got 2 or 3, or I don't know, but like
so
it's like kind of like secular Buddhism. It's your main goal in life is to experience the event. So I and to your question, I think there's 2 elements to that. I don't think if you're not suffering, you don't need to suffer well. Do you know what I'm saying? I'm not saying suffer unneedlessly or to find suffering. I'm not saying to go like take responsibility. Christ puts the cross on his back. Like find responsibility for sure. Pursue things that are meaningful to you, which is taking responsibility by default. And that there's value in that. So I'm breaking it into 2. There's externally validated things. So if your life is lovely and literally nothing as bad is happening, spread the love, baby. Like go find something that works for you in that agapic love context and pursue your wildest ambitions 100%. But if you also find yourself in a context that you cannot get out of, where you cannot generate those kind of 3 values of meaning, then at the baseline, rock bottom, you're in the worst case possible scenario, hell, everything's on fire, like just whatever is your worst case hell, you can always choose to suffer well. So I'm not saying that you have to, it doesn't have to anchor your day to day. It's just that, and you will eventually find yourself in these kind of scenarios. And with regards to the corrupting, and I can talk about both, but with regards to corrupting the soul, I see this all the time. Like from a police point of view, when people are doing things they know are bad, that are not the right thing to do. And again, what's right and what's wrong, it's a whole other conversation. But when you can see that it's breaking them. And I even have a relevant example this year. I have lots of thousands of examples of this. And everyone knows this. Like when you're doing something that you know you shouldn't do, you pay you don't get away with it. You pay a cost internally that is, in my experience, or at least my perspective, that isn't worth it. I don't think people get away with really anything in their life. Now, some people are malevolent and have like that sort of dark triad personality traits, and that's a whole other conversation. But just generally speaking, on a bell curve kind of component, I think people suffer when they do what they know they shouldn't. And I have a perfect example of this. I'm working at Interpol. There's been some, in my organization, there was some drama with some people within the organization doing things they shouldn't be doing, and like just within the normal range of bureaucracy and things that happen at big companies and people engaging, just normal human being stuff. But it created a scenario where some people, and one person who I'm thinking of did something that he shouldn't have done. So he didn't act honorably based on his own internal code. He knew he should have stuck up for someone, and he didn't, right? And I got to watch this individual over a year just like slowly get consumed by his inability to act courageously in the moment and to do the right thing. There's no a higher burden than the person who doesn't act morally when they need to. And it was very interesting. So that person chose to suffer poorly and did things that were against what he wanted to do because he felt pressure from someone who was mean above him to bow, right? And there was lots of negative things. As you can see, the posture when I first met this individual was positive. Everything's like, he's a strong individual. And then over this one period year was just, like by the end, he's crumpled. He's sitting in the corner. He's not effective from a professional point of view. People's perception of him is a lot lower than at the beginning. And then that sort of crisis resolved. And now he's back to normal, fine, but he paid a massive cost for that. And so again, it's a minor example. I didn't really give details, I suppose, but because it's not my place to do so. But just I think you can see this in your day to day. Like when I engage with people on a day to day basis, you can tell the people who are doing the things they know they need to be doing, and those who are not. I can clearly see it within short period of time with people, whether they're following that maxim organically without being able to articulate it or not. And I find personally, now that I've kind of adopted that for a long period of time now, now it's so sensitive that when I do something that I like, even something silly, like I should help that person walk across the street, but I didn't do it, like even little things, I'm like, like I can feel it like pulling at myself, because I sleep like perfectly at night, like I'm comfy, but I find that I'm actually in distress when I'm now not doing that kind of stuff. So I think there's for me anyways, there's like a fundamental baseline truth about sort of like the structure of reality as a human being, where it's like if you're not doing what you think you need to be doing, you will suffer for it. And that's just something I think is bedrock. And all the different philosophies and literatures, like they all sort of kind of crisscross on that. Yeah. It's the honesty value, right? Because like nothing works without it. So it's a biological underpinning where if you're like counterintuitively going against what you're biologically primed to do, you're going to suffer for it. It's not even just a philosophical thing. It's a physiology almost.
Do you see that in your line of work a lot from the cases you work on, from the crimes people
for sure
they're good people but they're in bad situations, or would you say it's more murky? It depends on the cases.
So I'll give you an extreme example. This was a large intuition to me in regards to human behavior. I engaged with Sam Harris, like the author guy, a lot of his stuff, and he talks about free will and things of that nature. And he portrays the point that I went in a podcast or in a book, I can't even remember now, but that like free will is dubious in the sense that like your body knows the thought before you say it, before you have awareness of it, and that your background in some cases dictates outcomes to an extent. So when I was working in one of those northern communities I referred to before, we used to, for example, when we would put people in the police truck, we had like a cage in the back for people. Not a cage, that's the wrong term, but like the two front seats and then the two back seats were for prisoners, right? Or people we'd arrested. And there was just that community was particularly violent, like I mentioned, and there's a lot of people who were struggling and having hard times in life. But I actually had earplugs that I would put in because it was a 10-minute to 15-minute drive from the community to where the police station was, and people would scream and yell so much consistently on a daily basis at us, and like mean things like "I'll kill you," like if you like just the absolute worst things you could possibly say to someone consistently at us over time. And I'd actually wear earplugs because it was so loud it actually hurt my ears, because they put their, it's called the silent patrolman. It's the plastic in between the police officer, the front cabin and the back, whatever that's what they call it. And there's little gaps, and so guys would stick their head like at the gap and then just scream. Sometimes just nonsense, but sometimes really mean stuff. And it actually would hurt your ears, because if someone yells in your ear for 10 minutes, it's actually difficult. So I actually had earplugs in for that, and it used to really rattle me because sometimes they would find ways through the armor. Not. I was pretty resilient to this, but sometimes, like if you were, let's say, an obese officer, like that, every day up there, anyways, every day someone would say something really mean to you, like meanest things you could possibly say to someone who is, let's say, overweight, or if you had some sort of physical imperfection, could be anything. Like I've got a big nose, so I'd always get like the beak, the nose, and to me it's funny because like I don't have an issue with that, but they're just trying to find a reason. And sometimes it get really personal, like because the community was small and we lived in it. There's only 2,500 people up there in that little community. So they say, I know who your wife is, and I'm going to get her, with lots of bad language attached to that. And that can really send you off the rails, right? So imagine that now for like a year, every day, like 7 days a week, getting this. So people would just like kind of go off the rails. And so as soon as I said, do they have, let's say, the free will to understand the actions that they're doing? And then sometimes you get psychological reports from individuals, and you see, this person's first memory is a sexual assault at like 4 or 5, and you're like, okay, that's like, wow. And then you just keep reading, and it's one bad event after another, and you're like, man, if we just flipped positions here, I'd be exactly like that person. So I have a huge degree of compassion, and I found just with that kind of concept, I was able to go, this person's yelling at me, I get it. If we flipped, I'd be in the same position, and that, even though I'm not enjoying the abuse, I'm able to go, I'm going to do the right thing, and I'm going to, be compassionate to this person, which is to say, do my job and, affect justice in the context that we're in. But I noticed my other colleagues would often be rattled for like the whole rest of the shift. Someone would get through the armor and say like that one thing that would kind of get to them, and they're just completely off the rails for, 40, like maybe a couple hours. But I'd be able to go,
because they can't see through that compassionate lens where
it's all the emotion, and then they're not able to take that emotion and flip it. Where I'm still getting the feeling like I'm not happy to be yelled at and get made fun of for my nose. My mom said I have a pretty face, but having that not to be true is disruptive. But I was able to flip it. But I wasn't like that before. I would be just as mad too. And I thought, I'm so mad. Why? It's kind of like a meditation thing. Now I'm looking back at myself. Like why? Why is that happening? And then I have to go, okay, well what are the mechanisms? And then one of the things that helped me with that was this kind of like this sense of the no free will, which is that the rat runs the maze, the mouse runs the maze, which is to say that the context that you're in will dictate the results. So if you were, I would say if you took 1,000 people from anywhere in the world and put them in that particular context, they would have done the exact same thing to an extent.
Yeah. So then where do you draw the balance of a I would say an appropriate level of compassion versus punishments or accountability for? I mean, it can get very textbook intellectual, because I know it's a subject matter is hotly debated in a lot of areas.
For sure.
Yeah. What's your take on that? Because one of the philosophy professors in my college, he specializes in determinism versus free will, and his view is that everything's determined, just like you said. It's pizza or fries. It's something that occurred before you made the choice,
right
of you, and that the implication of that is then you should have a justice system where there's more lenience for criminals.
Correct. Yeah.
So, then why should we still keep the criminal justice system? Is for demonstrative purposes to show other people, if you actively, consciously do this is what you could end up with.
For sure. It's a really good question. So when I'm talking about like leveraging like the free will concept in the context of work, I'm using that as like a tool. So if we talk about like determinism, like hard determinism versus soft, I just
opened a new Pandora's box.
Yeah, that's a whole other on paper conversation. What I'm using is I'm having a terrible time here. I need to de-escalate this in my mind, or I'm going to, have an emotional reaction that's not good for anybody. How can I rip this down? And that concept was useful for me. Yeah. It's kind of like you pick the religion that's useful to you, like what feels the best. It's that, So that's a different conversation. With regard to like criminal justice stuff. There's a certain percentage of people who will be influenced by the societal pressure to not do certain activities. So, like if I go to a person and I say, would you do this crime? One of the reasons, one they won't do it because they feel ethically motivated not to. Maybe they have good context that they're coming from, but two, they'll go, oh, there's a societal cost that I'm not willing to pay. And I don't mean like jail. I just mean like the social pressure is powerful to align people towards the mainstream. But there's a certain percentage of people, I think it's like 5 to 7%, who don't have that issue at all. So if they become ethically, let's say, in line with societal values and they don't do any crime, that's fantastic. Go become a CEO, go become a doctor, whatever. But if you go down the criminal route, there are some individuals who literally don't bow to the societal pressure to not do bad things. So a lot for me, it's not so much about like going to jail for justice's sake. It's more about like protection of the community more, because there are some people that like you just cannot rehabilitate. Like it's not no one on earth can do it. That's rare, but there are those people. And in the Canadian context, often people will, because it's hard to go to jail for a long time in Canada. So you'll see people do a bad crime like a sexual assault, something really bad, and then they'll spend a few years in jail, but they'll come back out, and then they'll re-victimize again. And you just see you'll see on their criminal record because you're looking at the person, you'll see like the same crime typology many times. And that's unfortunate. So I think that's the nexus. So regardless of their culpability in that, it's protection of the community as the first principle. I think that's where it's at. Yeah. And then you could break it down by crime genre, and it's a whole other. It's a huge conversation.
I think absolute justice is impossible. We just have to maximize the greater good for the community, and
Yeah, for sure.
And that lies right in your subject expertise too, like your career, your police background. I mean, I would have a lot of other questions on that too.
Yeah. Happy to take them. Yeah, no, it's a nuanced conversation, and I find that I've just kind of like poked at it. It's a big conversation, but my role before Interpol, I was director in the Serious and Organized Crime Division of the Ministry of Public Safety, and part of my role was the data broker for a research program and data broker for the province on all like law enforcement data, as well as running a research program on crime reduction issues, amongst other portfolios that I was managing at the time. And it was super interesting because oftentimes I would get like the data from the source. Like it would actually be like me personally calling the police chief of Vancouver and saying, I request this data on behalf of the province for this topic, whatever we were talking about. And so I'd actually pull that data, and then I would go, oh, well, from induction, I'd say, here's the data. This is what we can infer. And then people's perception outside of my little bubble were often much different. So I find that the whole criminal justice conversation, which we can go into, is often one based in not full facts on the ground. So often I'll get people that will come to me and say, Fraser, policing X, Y, Z, especially in North America. It's a touchy subject, right? And then I'll say, okay, well, especially when I was in the epicenter of the literal data transactions and in the know, often I would just provide information, not an opinion, but just like, here's the data. Here's how many crimes on, like racial crimes or things of that nature. And then roughly speaking, and then people would make an opinion off of that, which was different than their initial opinion when they came to me, if that makes sense. So it's an interesting conversation, but I like Sam Harris again, where there's kind of like a moral landscape. There's no objective right or wrong. It's just subjectively generated by all of us. So, when, for example, like if you take two babies and they're playing, like 2-year-olds, let's say, and one kid pokes the other kid in the eye, the other kid cries, oh, I want to keep playing, I'll stop doing that. We've just created we've created a game, or we've created a framework, a moral framework, and then now we're creating more complex ones at the societal level. So for me, it's a never-ending constant debate. So if you said, let's say, sex offenders should get 25 years, and like it's not fixed. I think that society continuously articulates and converses about it, and it never ends until forever. Because I think there's an element of that, those sort of peaks and valleys, and that's societal of ethics, the Sam Harris kind of moral landscape. So that there's going to be highs and lows, but those are going to change based on culture, people, and the epoch you're in, right?
Yeah. So I think if we move slightly away from ethics, because I find myself couldn't get my head away from that, the scenario described from when you're conducting the day-to-day policing in the police car and there are people shouting at you constantly. They're bad things. So how do you operate, carry on your day-to-day under threat? Do you minimize that? Do you actually take that to heart and think about it, or do you just kind of cast it aside and go Saudi another year? As a police officer, how do you go home and sleep at night thinking about like safety for you and your loved ones?
Yeah. I think, again, it's super, it depends on where you are at the time. So if I was like at Interpol, like I'm in the policing realm, let's say, but I'm very safe, like I'm more diplomat than law enforcement guy. Like, I'm going to be hiding in the van in the back. Like I'm 100 meters away from anything operational, which is good for me. So if you're like a detective working, let's say, sex crimes in, Chicago or something, like your experience is going to be much different than a frontline police officer in Miami, who's actually on the road, like dealing with stuff. Some jurisdictions, for example, are very relaxed. So when I was in Calgary Police, I worked on the street at a frontline level for a couple months before I did other things. And that experience was like just like in apples to chainsaws different, like just such a differerent experience.
So let's say for the ones that under extreme scenarios.
So
like those
So when I was in
front line.
When I was in northern Canada, the risk was high all the time. Like if you walked around the community just by yourself, often you'd have negative encounters just walking. Like you couldn't walk around in a relaxed way as you would in any other place necessarily. So it was a very unique scenario in that context. So it was constantly vigilant on guard. So I don't think anyone comes out of that experience without kind of a twitch, let's say. But on a case-to-case basis, especially if there was a moment to relax and think about it, I would ask myself, the Stoic thing is the same. I would go, is this event, like let's say, for example, I had one where there was a guy kidnapped a girl and then took her away on a boat. And then, and this was one of the worst people in the community. Like he was so bad that people would call the police when he was physically in the community. He actually lived in a cabin 2 to 3 days away from the community that he would boat to, and he was a trap liner, so he'd catch animals and get their fur, and then he would sell the fur for money. So he'd come into the community only like twice a year, or sometimes more. But he was so bad that when he just physically walked down the street, people would call the police. Just to paint a picture, okay? So this individual was, maybe older gentleman, above 50, and kidnapped a girl who was, let's say, below 20, and took her away for sexual purposes to float around. And we were able to retrieve her, so the story has a happy ending. But at one point, someone came into the police station and said, "We know where this person is, the girl. She's across the lake, and we have to go and we go grab her." But the person who came in was a relative of the subject of the complaint, the bad guy. So it made no sense that this person who was allied to this individual would come to tell us this information. And I thought, oh, this is like a trap. Like and the person who told us was someone who we, from a police point of view, interacted with many times, like arrested, So this was like not a normal person who just came off with the good intentions in their heart. And it just made no sense, and that it would never happen in any other context. And I thought, oh, this is definitely a trap, but we got to go. And so I called the boss, and the boss said, yeah, you got to go check it out. So we got a few guys together. We got the conservation officer to come join us and stuff. And when we went across, there was the guy pointed to where we should go, and it was just like on the other side of this lake. There's nothing out there. It's just like windy darkness, no moonlight or nothing, and it was just like kind of it just felt like we were gonna die. And I remember thinking, I'm 100% gonna get shot on this call, but I have to go do it. But I thought, is it worth it to do it? I actually had that thought. I was like, should I get off the boat, because we were like should I get off this boat and go walk down this dusty path and probably get shot in my mind? And everyone else would agree. It wasn't just my opinion of that. And I thought, yes, of course I have to do this. It's the right thing to do, the compassion element, and I'm cool with that. And then I actually, and this is the insight here, I met a judo third degree, what was he? He was a bronze medalist in the Olympics, judo guy, about 60. And we used to wrestle with him when we were doing our training for police stuff. And he used to do police combat stuff, like hand to hand. And he said, he's like, whenever you're fighting someone, whatever, you have to assume that you're already dead. The worst case scenario has happened, which again is you don't control outcomes. And he goes, as soon as you do that, you'll be able to move freely in the space. And so I would actually employ that as a mechanical trick. So I go, worst case scenario, I'm gonna get shot. Because if you get shot there, it's not like you just there's no hospital, right? Like you got to wait for a plane for 3 hours. Maybe they pick you up if the weather's good, and then 3 hours back. So golden hour of surviving is not there. So if I get any injury, like it's actually super serious, even like a broken arm, right? Like you're going to lose the arm if it's, if you got 6 or 7 hours and you've got bad blood flow. So it's not casual when you're going to do that stuff. And I remember just thinking, because I did this many times, I was like, am I cool to die in this scenario? Yes, 100%. Because the justification is high enough that I'm like, because that's when you sign up to be a police officer, like that's kind of the role. Like you're fundamentally, like you're supposed to insert violence in where violence is the state, right? Like you're the monopoly of power the state dictates, and if you got to die, you got to die. It's just how it goes. If there's a school shooting, like you got to run through the door, right? Of course, with tactics, and you want to self-preserve yourself, but at the end of the day, like you have to accept that that's a potential outcome. So in that case, I think everyone roughly did the same thing, and then I was quick. I'm moving through, no scared still, but completely fine to maneuver. And that case worked out. We actually didn't find that person there. The guy was lying. And we actually didn't go down the path, because I said, is this the path? And I said, you're coming with us. And as soon as I said, hey, you're coming with us, he was like, oh, well, let's not go down the path. So I don't know what was down that path specifically. He took us down a different one. And we went during the day when it was like daylight and there was nothing there, but maybe that was a trap. Maybe it wasn't. But at the time I thought, oh, I'm going to die. But lots of scenarios like that. And if you just have a second to just go, cool, is this worth the worst case scenario? As soon as you say yes, then you're free to move. I found that to be true in sports and all sorts of different stuff, even like scary stuff, like even this interview, like what's the worst case scenario? I say something silly. Is it worth it? Bam, clear, next. And that's something you can.
So the worst case scenario, when you walk in, even the community, would be like someone come up to you and beat you up.
Yeah.
Or when you're at home, would a community member just come and intrude your house?
Yeah, there was we lived in a compound, like not just normal housing. So okay. Not in La Ronge. La Ronge was normal housing, but when I was up in that Stony Rapids place, there was on the Indigenous Reserve, there was the Black Lake Reserve, there was one big compound in 2 different locations, like 2 groups of housing, and we had a big fence and stuff like that. But our houses were like it was a not a friendly environment for sure.
So what was the relationship like with your colleagues? And
really good. Everyone there was competent and professional. I never saw anything that was not, but it was a very difficult scenario. So lots of people were. Everyone, no one was mentally ill. That's the wrong term, but distressed, perhaps. Like when you're in a difficult scenario, like you're not yourself. So to an extent, so people who had been there for a month, you would recognize as normal Canadian context. But people who'd been there for, let's say, 2 years, because that was the maximum you could stay, 2 years.
Okay.
People who had done 2 years were not the same person when they started, because the volume of violence was so high and the environment so toxic. That it was difficult to not be tainted by that at a certain point, for sure. I think that's a good way.
If you don't mind asking, what was the worst thing happen to your unit, or to your colleague, or to you personally? Not as a competition, but just to give a context of the operating environment.
Oh yeah. it's a good question. I get this all the time, where it's like, what's your craziest story? It's and this might be just instructive. Like if for example if I was in a car crash, like if we were in a car together and we were expecting to arrive at our destination and we got in a fender bender, like someone rear-ended us, it's kind of traumatizing because you're like, oh, and you'd feel this kind of sense of like, oh, this is traumatic. But if I said, we're in this car and in 30 seconds we're going to get in a minor fender bender, so prepare yourself, then the fender bender wouldn't rattle you, because again, it's like I mentioned way back at the beginning here, where you have a perception of reality and that's kind of a narrative you've created, and that's part of it. So the most crazy thing that's happened to me probably aren't that crazy in the context of like the story, because so for example, like one time I pulled someone over for a traffic violation, running through a stoplight, and the two individuals had, it happened to be that the two of the most dangerous individuals in that community happened to be in the vehicle, but the vehicle belonged to someone I knew who wasn't those two people, and who was not. So I had made the fatal error of thinking, oh, this is going to be a very positive, friendly interaction, and just, hey, how you doing kind of thing. But it turned out to be not the person I thought in the vehicle. But so I just walked up and engaged with these individuals, and they may or may not have had firearms on them, and it was this awkward conversation, and I was able to slowly create some distance, back up, and let them go on their way, and we just avoided a sort of a shootout on that scenario. But nothing really happened in that event other than just this really tense scenario. But that really rattled me, because in my mind I was like, oh, like this traffic stop is vanilla. It's just a, I'm on my way to coffee kind of scenario. I know this person who owns the vehicle. This is going to be a 30-second conversation, and it's fine, right? Because I just kind of rolled the stop line. But it ended up being like this almost potentially like fatal kind of scenario with the two worst individuals in the community at the time. So it's an example of police officers, when they have really bad experiences, often when something has happened that they haven't anticipated. And that's where you get at the worst, where I've got lots of crazy stories where I at least had 5 minutes notice before the event happened. Like someone has lost an arm from a machete fight, like that's a call we went to, right? Like, or homicides with ridiculous kind of context attached to them. But you get a couple seconds to brace yourself for that, and then the event isn't crazy to you personally. So that's kind of the difference there.
That's very interesting. Yeah, it's always the unexpected that rattles you. Even if a few seconds that can get you realign your reality and have the right mindset going into it.
Yeah,
I think a common thread for our long conversation so far has been the juxtaposition of reality and your perception of it, and the space in between, and how do you work on that to be more resilient, to overcome adversity, both in your career and personal life. So I've kept you for a long time, so I think it might be a good time to wrap it up. I'm sure we have a lot to talk as well.
Yeah,
definitely. So thank you so much, Fraser, for coming on, and I definitely look forward to welcoming you back on the show.
Yeah. No, thank you for having me. And I guess as just a final up.
Yes, please. Any final thoughts?
No. Thank you for listening to me drone on. But I think that you could, if you don't like the narrative you're in, you can change it. And that's a key element. So even if you're in hell, you can reframe things to be an opportunity. If you're in a bad spot, you can just go, good, I'm in a bad spot, time to move out of, or if you think the narrative of life is not where you want it to be, it's not real. Like, where is it? Where are the thoughts? Like, you can't physically touch them, so they exist for your benefit. So the thoughts aren't you. The thoughts are just something that you're aware of, and I mean the global you, and you can change those thoughts. And I think that's a key insight. And if you're a person that hasn't had that thought, that insight, that the thoughts aren't you, that or not the total of you, let's say, that can lead you, if you have curiosity, that can lead you down a lot of interesting paths. I think.
Yeah,
that'd be my fun.
A great insight to end on.